And so we look at the brain as something that extremely, as a fluid process that's malleable and not fixed and set in its own ways. It has this fluidity to it. So that's kind of my view of the brain overall, that it's a dynamic object. But beyond that, let me also explain some of our experiments. So the way that we approach science and probing the human brain is through experiments where we look at conceptual experiments in neuroscience. So, for example, there's the rubber hand illusion, if you probably know that.
Lay it out and explain it to people.
So the rubber hand illusion is this illusion where you have a chap, he puts his hand right here, and then you have his right hand underneath the table, right? And so me, Balan, the experimenter, will stroke and tap the hand of the experimental subject. I'll go stroke, stroke, tap, 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 stroke, stroke underneath the table. And I'll stroke and tap the table in front of Joe, the subject. I'll go tap, tap, stroke, 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 tap, tap. And about 2 minutes of me doing this, he will feel touch sensations arising from the table. And I don't mean this in kind of an abstract metaphorical sense. I mean this literally. He will have touch sensations, somatosensory regions of his brain becoming active from this process.
Yeah, well, that's a very strange element of human perception, right? It must be strongly associated not only with our ability to map sensation onto our bodies,
right,
but also with our ability to use tools. So I know, for example, we're very good at it. Like if I pick up a screwdriver,
right,
it takes me virtually no time to use the tip of the screwdriver in a manner that very much approximates the tip of my finger.
Right.
Right. And then when we go in a car, essentially what we're doing, especially once we're expert drivers, is that we expand the dimensions of our kinesthetic perception, our bodily perception, to include the car, right? So you're feeling with the tires, you're feeling with the brake, right? And that's, well, part of my understanding of that is that that's very tightly associated with our tool using proclivity, because a tool is a bodily extension.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an embodiment, right? So in 2 minutes, I turn this subject into a table, right? And then more than that, if Baland was to take a hammer and go like this on the table, he'll go, he'll feel pain sensations, right? So the pain regions of his brain will light up if I was to look in a scanner and look at the neurons there. So it shows you that in that way you can take something, first of all, you can create a sensation of this table belonging to you, but then
being part of you.
Big part of you, right? It becomes an embodied part of you. But then beyond that, you inflict pain now to the person, to the table, in fact, and then you will feel.
Yeah, that would also be part of social perception, I presume. I read a paper not long ago. If I remember the details carefully, they were looking at the difference. I think the dimension was agreeableness,
right?
But it might have been psychopathy,
right?
Which would be the opposite of agreeableness. Right. Let's say that more agreeable people, so less psychopathic people, have more pain activation to the perception of other people's pain.
Right.
So you could imagine that part of the utility in being able to morph your pain sensitivity, even to represent something objective like a table,
right?
That's also a variant of my ability to map my own body, let's say, onto your body, so that the empathy that I feel for you isn't conceptual.
Right.
And I've really been thinking about this in terms of how we understand each other, because it looks to me like what we do to understand each other is I notice what your aim is, partly by watching your eyes.
Right.
I infer your aim. Once I infer your aim, I can inhabit your perceptual space, because if I know your aim, I know the objects that surround you. But I also know how your emotions are configured, because they're configured in relationship to the aim.
Yeah.
If I can adopt that aim, then I can embody those emotions and perceptions.
Right.
I can read off that embodiment, and then so the understanding is actually my simulating you on my own neural architecture, and then drawing the appropriate inferences from that. And it looks to me like children probably develop that ability. Some of it's nascent, I would say. Some of it's there.
It's very interesting. So we were the first group to show that people with OCD, who has a very fixed sense of self, right? So they wash their hands all the time, washing and scrubbing. When they do this illusion, they have a much more sensitivity to it, to the extent that there's a control condition for this illusion, where for the illusion to occur, you have to stroke and tap tap, tap, stroke, and tap in a synchronized manner. That's very important, right? So that's key.
Are you tired of being held back by one-size-fits-all healthcare? Of having your concerns dismissed or being denied that comprehensive lab work you need to truly understand your health? I want to tell you about Marek Health, the premier health optimization platform that's revolutionizing how we approach wellness and longevity. What sets Marek apart isn't just their cutting-edge diagnostic labs or concierge health coaching, it's their commitment to treating you as an individual. Their expert clinical team stays at the forefront of medical research, creates personalized, evidence-based protocols that evolve with you. Unlike other services that rely on cookie-cutter solutions, Marek Health goes the extra mile. They consider your unique lifestyle, blood work, and goals to craft recommendations that actually work for you, whether that's through lifestyle modifications, supplementation, or prescription treatments. And with a remarkable 4.9 out of 5 rating on Trustpilot, you know you're in great hands. The best part is you can get 10% off your order today. Just head to MarekHealth.com and use code Peterson at checkout. That's MarekHealth.com, code Peterson for 10% off. Stop guessing and start optimizing your health today with Marek Health, because your best life starts with your best health.
Right. So you're linking the visual perception to the kinesthetic perception?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely, right? But in people with so the control for this, by the way, is if you do it in a random sequence like tap, tap, stroke, stroke, but everything is just random, right? And you do, again, the touching and stroking is random, then the illusion will not occur, or it will be slightly. So you have a slight illusion there, or most of the time, no illusion. So this is the key control for the illusion.
Right. So let's just walk through this so everybody understands clearly. So you have someone with their arm on a table, let's say, their left arm. Their right arm is under the table. So they can no longer see it. Now, what you're doing then is you're interacting with their hidden arm physically. And but they can't see that. They can feel it. At the same time, you interact with the table where they can see it.
Absolutely.
So you're syncing their visual perception with their kinesthetic perception.
Absolutely.
But it's not. But their visual perception isn't focused on their own hand.
Right.
Now they start to react to the table like it's a hand.
Correct.
Okay, now you're extending this to the OCD situation.
Yes.
Okay, so elaborate on that.
Absolutely. And I just want to, one point here is that I mentioned a table. So the original experiment was done with a rubber hand, right? But I'm using table because it's more, it illustrates the experiment better. And I think, and you can have a table as well. So
people would start responding to a rubber hand as if it was their own.
So instead of a table, you just have a rubber hand that looks like your own hand. And then you stroke and tap the rubber hand right in front of the person.
Right, with their other hand hidden.
Correct.
They start to respond to the rubber hand as if it's theirs.
Right, exactly.
And then flinch if there's a threat to it.
They flinch if there's a threat to it, right?
Okay.
So,
and that can be extended to something as inanimate as a table.
Correct.
Right. Okay.
Or in fact, you can do it in air. So you do know Rich McNally?
Yes.
A common friend, right? Over at Harvard, right? So one day McNally and I did it in the air. So I did it on Rich. Call him Rich. So it stroke, tap, tap in the air, and he felt the rubber like his own hand was floating in the air. It was kind of spooky.
Wow.
He went, my God, what's happening? I feel my hand is floating in the air.
Right. That must also be associated with a really profound, with our sense of what constitutes ownership.
Right.
Because the idea that something is yours or that something is mine, there's no reason to assume that isn't an extension of something like embodiment. It's certainly the case that, if people's cars are attacked, let's say, or kicked, they respond to that very much as if it's a bodily assault. Right. And so it begs the question, how much of our embodied concept of ownership, like that concept on which we platform the philosophical and philosophy and conception of ownership, is actually the underlying scaffold for that is our ability to extend our embodiment to even inanimate objects, right? Because then they start to become part of us, right? And part of what you're pointing to with your emphasis on brain plasticity, and that is that identity itself, even in terms of perception and pain sensitivity, is fluid and dynamic to a degree that you wouldn't immediately presume.
And I do want to differentiate between plasticity and then the dynamic nature of the function and of the modules of the brain. So, for example, you have, in terms of the rubber hand illusion, it shows that, for example, we have a structure called the TPJ right here. Temporoparietal junction is the fancy name for that. That structure is important for taking all the sensory modalities, touch, hearing, feeling, right? So smelling, and sort of and unifying that into a whole and talk. And
That's a cortical area?
It's a cortical area.
Where is it located?
It's called the TPJ, so it's temporoparietal junction. So it's kind of strategically located between the different occipital, somatosensory region and the temporal.
Right. So is it a region that overlaps physiologically between the different sensory integration systems?
Exactly. It's like a crossroad, so to speak.
Right. Is it the same area that's used for silent reading?
Silent reading, I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, the reason I'm asking about that, from what I remember, is that the region that we use for silent reading is the overlap between the auditory and visual cortex.
Right.
Which makes perfect sense, right? Because we're basically, when we read silently, we're using our eyes as ears.
Right.
Yeah. So, and those overlapping areas. Okay, so this area is a
TPJ.
place between between a variety of the different sensory
Between different
integration.
sensory integration,
Yeah.
it's a hub for integration. And interestingly, actually, it's also involved in the self-other distinction. So we have a distinction of Baland here, Dr. Peterson over there, and then
That's why we can't tickle ourselves.
that's why we can't tickle ourselves, right? But that part of the brain, if you zap that, sometimes the self-other distinction can break down. So you feel like you're merging into another person. So that's very interesting. So it has that function. It also has connections to the frontal lobes, which is involved in, obviously, in empathy and seeing the perspective of somebody else. So feel like a theory of mind. What is Dr. Peterson thinking right now? What is his agenda right now? What is his motives? So that ability is also involved.
I've wondered
and this
about
comes to psychopathy point, actually,
Right,
because
right.
if you have the temporoparietal junction being involved in body construction, so it's involved in self and constructing a body image, which is expanded in the rubber hand illusion, but also involved in seeing your perspective as well. So it's very dynamic and
Experiencing your perspective.
it's experiencing somebody else's perspective.
So one of the things I thought while you were discussing that is the theory of mind, theories of autism, that
Right.
autistic people lack theory of mind.
Yeah.
But I've never really liked that theory because